Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are thrilled to have you join us for the session of the history and economy of modern Russia with our distinguished speaker, Dr. Oleg Mukovskiy. We welcome you to another webinar of International Forum of Journalists, Russia, Africa, the way of friendship and cooperation. And today's lecture will explore the historical forces that have shaped modern Russia, offering valuable concept for its current role in the world. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Oleg Mukovskiy.
Thank you very much, Marina Bogdanova, and thank you very much, Alpha Dialogue. Good afternoon and good morning to all of you. We are now having a very ambitious session because I'll try to give you a brief overview of Russia's more than 1,000-year-long history. And if we have time left by the end of this session, I'll give you some ideas on how Russian economy works and functions at present. So, without much ado, we better begin. So, for thousands of years, the lands that today belong to Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus have been inhabited by nomads of various ethnic backgrounds. All that remains of them are various burials with household items, weapons, and jewelry. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus called them Scythians, and the Greeks had trade relations and wars with them. Their lands were occupied later by other nomadic tribes moving between the Roman Empire, or towards the Roman Empire, like Goths, Huns, and Avars. Here you can see the Slavic tribes in the first millennium AD. As you can notice, they were inhabiting the areas, the vast steppe areas, mainly between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. This is where the beginnings of Slavic civilization start to form on the territory of modern Russia. Since the 7th century AD, Slavs and Indo-European tribes have settled in these lands. There were a lot of different Slavic tribes. There are still many different Slavic tribes now, Western, Southern, and Eastern. Previously, the Slavic languages were closer to their source, the Proto-Slavic language, but now, and were mutually understandable mostly. That's what we believe. But now, many distant Slavic languages are no longer mutually intelligible. According to a legend, in the 9th century, the Eastern Slavs invited a Scandinavian leader and military official, warrior named Rurik, to unite all the tribes separated and rule their lands. In 1882, Oleg, the successor of Rurik, captures Kiev and makes it the new capital. In 988, Prince Vladimir the Great, or Vladimir the Saint, emphasizing the connection of the Russian state with the Christian world of Europe, converted to Christianity in the country that had been pagan before. In the 11th century, Prince Yaroslav the Wise approved the first codified laws for the Russian state, for the ancient Russian state. It was the heyday of ancient Russia. Unfortunately, after his death, his numerous relatives did not preserve the unity of the state, and it broke up into several small feudal states. Unfortunately, this led to the fact that in 1223, the Mongol army of Genghis Khan defeated the Russian army on the territory of modern Russia. But then, somehow strangely, the Mongol army retreated back to deep into Asia. They returned in 14 years. All the major cities of Russia, except for Novgorod the Great in the north, were occupied by Mongol troops. And on the picture you can see the storm of Kiev by Mongols. Kiev, the then capital of ancient Russian state. At the same time, Prince Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod, in addition to trying to build some working relationship with Mongols, especially with then their leader Han Bato, had to defend his lands from Western European, mainly Swedish and German, invaders in northwestern Russia. This is Prince Alexander Nevsky. In 1242, the Novgorod army defeated the army of the Teutonic Order, mainly Germans and Swedes, on the ice of Lake Pepsi. Lake Pepsi is now the border between Russia and the European Union. The border between it is now separating Russia, the Russian Federation, and Estonian Republic. So, as I have to say, Prince Alexander Nevsky since then is one of the most revered saints of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Mongols ruled their lands from the town of Sarai on the Volga. Russian called them Tatars after one of the Turkic peoples nearby. Later, the term Tatar-Mongol yoke appeared, but this term has nothing to do with modern Tatars, one of the most numerous peoples of Russia. Alexander Nevsky's son, Daniel, founded the Moscow Principality, which began to grow and develop rapidly. In 1380, Dmitry Donskoy defeated the Mongol army. The Golden Horde, as the Mongol state on the territory of Russia was then called, began to break up into smaller regions in Russia and Siberia. 100 years later, Russia completely freed itself from Mongol influence. On the other hand, in 1453, as you may well know, the Byzantine Empire and its capital Constantinople were conquered by the Ottoman Turks. Moscow is then becoming the Third Rome, the term with which not everyone agrees with. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Moscow continued to annex and unite new lands. Ivan IV was first crowned as Tsar of Russia in 1547. He is better known to the world as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible managed to expand to the east, but there was no particular success with Sweden and Poland in the west. By the end of the 16th century, Siberia and the tribes living there were mostly annexed to Russia. Arkhangelsk was found in the north, the only port in the European part of Russia that had a fast connection to Europe, primarily Britain, Germany, and Netherlands. The beginning of the 17th century was a state of anarchy and turmoil. Polish troops occupied Moscow. Swedish troops occupied Novgorod in the north of Russia. You can see the violet color on the picture. That's where the Swedish troops were moving towards Novgorod in the north. And the yellowish brown color shows you how Polish troops were approaching Moscow from the west. The Russian state at that time, in the beginning of the 17th century, was on the verge of extinction. In 1612, the Russian militia, whose detachments began to form on the Volga, expelled the Poles from Moscow. There is a monument to their commanders, Prince Pozharsky and Merchant Minin, on Red Square in Moscow. This day, November 4, is Russia's main national holiday, National Unity Day. In 1613, at the Zemsky Sobor, or National Congregation of Representatives from most classes of the society, a young aristocrat called Mikhail Romanov, you can see him now on the picture, was elected the new Tsar of Russia. His dynasty would rule until 1917. His son Alexei introduced serfdom for peasants in Russia, which lasted for more than 200 years. At the same time, Patriarch Nikon carried out reforms in the Orthodox Church, its modernization, which not everyone accepted. The division of the historically unified Russian Orthodox Church into Niconians and the Old Believers continues today. In 1654, Ukraine and Russia signed an agreement on eternal unification. At the end of the 18th century, Russia joined the coalition of European states at war with Turkey, and the first treaty with China was also signed in the 18th century. Peter I, or Peter the Great, was the first Russian Tsar to assume the title of Emperor. He ruled Russia from 1689 till 1724. He was the first Russian ruler to make a long journey through Europe, mastering new technologies of military affairs and shipbuilding, as well as a wide variety of sciences. Peter started many reforms, from the army and navy to clothing and shaving beards, successfully competed with Sweden and Turkey, and in 1703 founded a new capital, St. Petersburg. Under Peter, the most professional architects, builders, artists from Europe and further afield began to come and work in Russia. Peter made a personal friend and field marshal of Russia of a young African who in Russia was called Ibrahim Hannibal. Hannibal studied in Paris. You can see him here on the left. He became not only an outstanding military officer, but also a scientist, a theorist of military science, fortification. Alexander Pushkin, his descendant, is the greatest Russian poet and writer who had influenced the modern Russian language the most. And you can see Alexander Pushkin on the picture on the right, next to the picture of his great-grandfather, who was of African origin. For many years, we in Russia thought that he came somewhere from Ethiopia or Abyssinia, as it was called then, but now there are different versions of his birthplace, and some African countries argue who he belongs to. I know that there are people who believe he was born in Cameroon, there are people who believe he was related to Senegal, and other versions also appear. In 1709, Peter inflicted a decisive defeat on Sweden near Poltava, present-day Ukraine. Russia becomes a great European power. In 1724, while helping residents of St. Petersburg to escape the floods used to be very regular, at least once a year in St. Petersburg. You can see this very moment when he was trying to save people to help them escape the flood. He contracted pneumonia and died in early 1725. This time is followed by several rapidly changing rulers. This is an era of palace coup d'etats. Stability returned only in 1742, when Peter's daughter, Elizabeth, became empress and ruled for 20 years, since 1742 till 1762. I want you to realize it was the very middle of the 18th revolution, long before the French, it was the very middle of the 18th century, decades before the French Revolution. And it's interesting to know that during her rule for 20 years, not a single death sentence was carried out in Russia. After her, from 1762 to 1796, Russia was ruled by the famous Catherine II, or Catherine the Great. There are several English language films and French language films and TV series about Elizabeth and Catherine, so I recommend you to get acquainted with them. They are very beautiful. Costumes, landscapes, people, architecture, and art. Catherine the Great was a supporter of the Enlightenment, corresponded with Voltaire. Another French philosopher, Denis Diderot, came and visited St. Petersburg and stood in St. Petersburg for a while. It should be noted that at the same time, Benjamin Franklin from the United States became the first American elected to the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. At that time, a huge collection of world art was largely formed, which would later form the basis of one of the world's greatest museums, art and history museums, the Hermitage, a museum in St. Petersburg. Catherine's grandson, Alexander I, you can see him here on the left, initially could not cope with the Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant military man and ruler. In 1805-1807, Russian and Austrian troops, who were then allies, were defeated by Napoleon. In 1812, Napoleon invades Russia. A difficult war begins. The French occupy Moscow, and the city is badly damaged in a fire. Napoleon, however, retreats, as he has no reserves left, food for soldiers and horses, and no warm clothes. The Russian army is increasing its attacks, and the French army is beginning to flee on the territory of modern Belarus. In 1814, Russian troops took Paris. Napoleon abdicated from power. In the 19th century, the annexation of new lands to Russia continued. Georgia, Armenia, the Caucasus as a whole, and parts of Central Asia. In 1837, the first railway was opened in Russia, and regular train service between St. Petersburg and Moscow exists since 1851. Soon it will be 200 years. In 1861, Alexander II abolished serfdom in Russia. In 1867, America buys Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, which in modern prices is somewhat over a few billion dollars. In the second half of the 19th century, outstanding writers, poets, composers, and artists worked in Russia. To give you just some of the names, they were Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Chekhov, Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, and many, many others. In 1914, the First World War began, without much success for Russia and its allies. Prices were rising in cities, and there was a shortage of food throughout the country. The military refused to disperse the demonstrations. In February 1917, representatives of the State Duma, the parliament, and the government arrived in the carriage of the emperor at a small station near Pskov in the north of Russia. Nicholas II, you can see the last Romanov family, and with Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor in the center, signed his abdication of the throne in favor of his younger brother, Mikhail, who unfortunately the next day also refused to rule Russia. This ended the reign of the Romanovs. This is called the February Revolution of 1917. Russia becomes a republic under the control of a provisional government. But the radical socialists and communists did not want to stop. In October 1917, they carried out a coup led by Lenin and Trotsky, which is called the Great October Socialist Revolution. In July 1918, the entire family of the last emperor Nicholas II was executed in the Urals, where they were staying under house arrest. Russia became the world's first communist state. One of the longest and bloodiest civil war in history had begun after that.
October Revolution. The October Revolution was a coup d'etat orchestrated by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, a quiet takeover of power in Petrograd at night. It is said that power was literally lying on the ground and Lenin just picked it up. Background: it was generally hoped by the Central Powers in World War I that Russia would be collapsed by revolution. That was also the hope of radical socialists, communists, in Russia, who believed in Karl Marx's theory that a socialist revolution of the working class would occur, but not before a bourgeoisie government had ruled for some time. The liberal February Revolution occurred sooner than expected and put the liberal bourgeoisie government in place. Lenin. German secret police then collaborated with the radical socialist leader, Vladimir Lenin, to help him cross the frontier from Zurich to Petrograd in a sealed train so he could organize a socialist revolution. In April 1917, Lenin arrived and presented his April thesis. He said that, regardless of Marx's theory, the Bolshevik Party must not cooperate with the provisional government. More, they needed to start preparing to take power by force instead. The time was finally right by September 1917. Bolshevik members had gained majority in the Soviets, they had formed armed militias called the Red Guards, and the popularity of the provisional government was at a record low. Lenin then had a pivotal role in convincing the Bolshevik Party to act immediately. October Revolution. On the 7th of November 1917, as the citizens of Petrograd were dining in restaurants and enjoying the theater, Bolshevik armed groups were busy taking over key strategic points: the telegraph, army garrisons, and the railway. It all went incredibly quietly. The whole operation was coordinated by Leon Trotsky and the Military Revolutionary Committee from their headquarters at Smolny. The next morning, the Winter Palace was taken over rather peacefully. The battleship Aurora fired a few blank shots, and members of the provisional government were arrested. Kerensky managed to escape. Soviet Congress. Lenin rushed to complete the coup before the next Soviet Congress gathered. It was scheduled to take place on the same day. Other members of the Congress wanted power to be divided between all socialist groups, but Lenin wanted it reserved only for the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks, moderate radical socialists, and socialist revolutionaries, agrarian socialists, then said they wanted nothing to do with the unlawful seize of power and walked out of the Congress, leaving Bolsheviks to form the new government alone.
Alpha Dialogue will circulate the illustrative material of this presentation to all the participants of the forum and of this particular seminar. And in order to save some time, I have added some video slides with video material. In December 1922, the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was announced. In January 1924, Vladimir Lenin died after a long illness, and by 1929, Joseph Stalin's almost sole power was finally consolidated in the country. 100 years ago, a powerful industrialization policy began in the USSR, thanks to which the country was able to survive and win the Second World War. And of course, thanks to the enormous sacrifice and heroism of the population, the military, the partisans, those who worked for the victory, who defended Moscow and Leningrad, those who reached Berlin. As with the Great October Socialist Revolution, there is a very interesting short film on Russia in World War II, which we call in Russia the Great Patriotic War. And you'll be able to have access to it with the circulation.
Russia in World War II. World War II was the most widespread and destructive war in history. It was a military conflict that grew out of the consequences of the First World War. The Soviet Union came out of World War II more powerful than ever. The only balancing power was the United States of America. Background: in the 1930s, the system created according to the Treaty of Versailles by the winners of World War I began breaking down, and the political climate in Europe became very tense. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, began taking land that was inhabited by Germans. At the same time, Stalin was also preparing for war. Alliance with Hitler. On 23rd of August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of Mutual Non-Aggression between Russia and Germany was signed. It gave Hitler and Stalin a free hand to attack their spheres of interest in Europe. The first target was Poland. On 17th of September 1939, Stalin followed Hitler and invaded the eastern half of Poland. In November 1939, Stalin declared war on Finland. The Winter War ended with an informal defeat for Stalin. Of 1 million men that were sent there, at least 200,000 died, and Finland remained independent, although it had to cede some border areas to Soviet Union. In 1940, Stalin also annexed the Baltic states. Great Patriotic War. Although neither one decided to keep to the non-aggression pact, Hitler made the first move, attacking Russia on 22nd of June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, as it was called, came as a shock to Stalin. Thus, the German-Soviet War, 1941 to 1945, began. In Russia, it is known as the Great Patriotic War. The Soviet Union was not yet ready for war, and Hitler's Blitzkrieg, lightning war tactic, was a huge success. After 5 months, all the land between Leningrad, former Petrograd, and Rostov had been invaded. The siege of Leningrad, 1941 to 1944, lasted an unprecedented 900 days, but with little success. Hitler was also unable to conquer Moscow in the winter of 1941. The turning point in World War II was Germany's defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, near the southern oil fields that Hitler badly needed. Up to 2 million men lost their lives there, under the commanders Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky. Hitler's army was forced to withdraw. After the Battle of Kursk, August 1943, it was clear that Germany would lose the war. Results. In February 1945, the Allied leaders, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, met at the Yalta Conference in Crimea, where the post-war world order was agreed on. The fact that Soviet troops were just 60 kilometers from Berlin gave Stalin an incredibly strong negotiating position. After Germany surrendered on 9th of May 1945, Soviet time, Stalin was reluctant to withdraw his troops and went on to turn Eastern Europe countries into his satellite states. Thank you for watching.
After the war, the Soviet Union formed a socialist camp in Eastern Europe, which declared building socialism. They received a lot of those countries, following the way of the Soviet Union, received a lot of support, as did many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. One of the most important events was the launch of the first satellite in the USSR in 1957. And the first human space flight happened on the 12th of April, 1961. Here in the picture, you can see a space module designed for Laika, the first dog who managed to go into space and return and live happily ever after. He returned safe. This is also a video, documentary, a film about Yuri Gagarin's start on the 12th of April.
Юрий Гагарин стал первым космонавтом планеты. 12 апреля 1961 года началась новая эпоха в жизни людей. Эпоха полетов в космосе. И имя Гагарина неразрывно связано с именем Королева.
Кедр, я Заря-1. Как слышите меня? Буду вам транслировать команды. Прием.
Заря-1, я Кедр. Вас понял, занимал исходное положение, занял, поэтому несколько задержал с ответом. Прием.
Ключ на дренаж. Ключ на дренаж. Есть дренаж. Зажигание. Кедр, я Заря-1. Зажигание.
Понял вас, дается зажигание.
Предварительно. Желаю вам доброго полета!
Я Заря-1, мы все желаем вам доброго полета, все нормально? Поехали!
...1961, and there is very interesting footage, and you can play it also. It will cover the circulation. To brief you a little bit on the present day city level of space exploration. This is a copy of the International Space Station called Mir, which is World or Peace in Russian, which is occupied and developed jointly by Russian, American, and Japanese space cosmonauts and astronauts. You can see the size, it's slightly wider and bigger than a long-haul present-day jet. So the conditions for those who stay there in the space for months becoming more and more comfortable, although they still remain tremendously risky and dangerous. All those people from Russia, China, the United States, Japan, and all other countries are heroes, of course. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power as the Communist Party leader of the Soviet Union, which at the time meant the leader of the country. He immediately began democratic reforms. Perestroika and glasnost were two symbols of that era. Perestroika means join many languages of the world, but literally perestroika means rebuilding. And glasnost means openness, especially openness of the press and media. However, very rapid democratic reforms led to the decentralization of the country, which was tightly controlled. It used to be tightly controlled from the center before. Many Union republics who were constituting the USSR wanted to become independent states. In December 1991, the creation of the CIS, or the Commonwealth of Independent States, was announced in Belarus. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. In December 1991, Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia. On the 31st of December 1999, on the brink of new year, the year 2000, he resigned, and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, the then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, who won the year 2000 election, became acting president. Dmitry Medvedev was president of Russia from 2008 to 2012, and Vladimir Putin has been president of Russia since 2012 till present time. The last Russian presidential election was in March 2024, and Vladimir Putin won with approximately 87% of vote in the very first round. This shows that he is by far the most popular Russian politician till the present day. This is my very, very brief overview. It's our very brief overview of Russia's history, which took us about half an hour. And now, for some 10 minutes, I'll try to give you a brief introduction to the Russian economy. Russian economy ranks approximately 5th or 6th in the world in terms of the GDP. Most likely, Russia ranks 2nd in Europe. In terms of the ratio of GDP to per capita income, Russia ranks far from the highest. If you wish and are interested, you can always find the latest and up-to-date information in reference books and on the internet. I will only briefly try to describe what the modern Russian economy looks like through the eyes of an ordinary person. Like everything in Russia, the economy, regardless of the current situation, growth or recession, or a period of stability, is always very, very large. What is important to know? In 1913, before the outbreak of the First World War, Russia was the leading economy in Europe. After a difficult war for Russia, the October Revolution followed, as a result of which the already heavily damaged country began to build socially. What this meant in reality? A ban on private ownership of the means of production, that is, factories, agricultural enterprises, services, education, and everything in general. A 100% planned socialist economy was built in the country. in which any minimum production or services had to be planned well in advance and included in the plan for a year and 5 years. This led to strange results very often. The official of Gosplan or the state planning authority forgot, for instance, that it was necessary to increase the production of meat or milk and cheese, and they were not available in stores. The stores, of course, were also state-owned. Then they remembered about it, but they forgot to take into account that the number of private cars in the country, for instance, is growing and more gasoline is needed. Accordingly, queues and restrictions at the gas station. I won't even talk about fancy shoes or jeans. All goods of the luxury and fashion categories were brought from abroad by those citizens who could officially leave. There were few of them, as the state did not encourage ordinary citizens to travel abroad, especially to the capitalist, so-called capitalist countries, because they might well see something that did not conform to the strict ideological dogmas of the Communist Party. These few travelers were diplomats, sailors, military personnel, and some other categories of citizens. There was certainly a black market in the country where you could always buy American jeans for the price of an average salary of 1 month. But if such jeans appeared in the store, even if they were not American, but Italian or Finnish or Polish, if you were lucky, then you could grab them for half of your monthly salary. At the same time, it is important to remember that for all the shortcomings of the planned system, the Soviet Union got rid of the famine in the 1920s and 1930s, brilliantly won the Second World War, which the Allies, primarily Great Britain and the United States, entered only in late 1943, when it was already clear that the USSR itself would defeat Germany. Well, maybe not so soon. As you and I already know, the Soviet Union was the first to send a man into space and develop the most advanced scientific research. All the planes and helicopters in the country were locally made, and by the way, they are now returning to our skies. Thanks God. Medicine and pharmacology were world class, as were mathematics, physics, biology, and other sciences. What is very important, the country has always had clear and government-set prices for everything, guaranteed wages and social security. The USSR has never been completely closed off from cooperation with the West. There have always been joint scientific and production projects. In the early 1970s, the USSR, together with Italian Fiat, launched mass production of modern cars, which gradually became accessible to a large number of ordinary people. They were both purely local and very good cars, including luxury ones. It should also be borne in mind that during the 1960s and the 1980s, the USSR was very active in helping not only politically and militarily, but also economically, with money and goods, dozens of states in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. In the late 1980s, perestroika and liberalization of the political and economic systems began. One is impossible, naturally, without the other. And the first cooperative enterprises in the service sector began to appear in the country. Then there were many joint ventures with foreign participation, capital, and technology. Today, Russian business is actively developing joint ventures in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Today's Russian economy can be described as a mixed type, with private and public sectors. The state has created several very large national corporations that are run as private companies, but the state owns a controlling stake in them. These are such giants as Gazprom, Rosneft, Rosatom, and many others. The public sector accounts for approximately 70% of the gross domestic product, the GDP. Naturally, all service companies, trade, financial services, clothing manufacturing, most of the agricultural industries, communications, internet businesses, from global to small, food production, all this now is in private hands and is developing rapidly and has modern technologies. The government is trying to control the development of the space industry, aviation, shipbuilding, both civil and military, the extraction and export of raw materials, gold and precious metals. Education and healthcare exist both as public organizations and as private or autonomous ones. The problems of the modern Russian economy include the different level of development of different regions, hence the different standards of living, different salaries in different parts of the country. However, the cost of living also varies greatly by region. But to give you one example, very simple, very soon we are celebrating Easter, and the cost of traditional Russian foods for a family celebration is the cheapest this year in the Republic of Mordovia. It's a subject of the Russian Federation on the Volga River, and it's approximately $4 American. And the most expensive, the same set of traditional Easter foods like eggs, cottage cheese, Easter cake, and some others in the far east of Russia, on the Chukotka Peninsula, which is very close to Alaska, is about $10. So you can see the difference in living standards, in salaries, and in prices. I think the opportunities for economic cooperation between African states and Russia are quite extensive. This may include training in Russian universities for African students, both in Russian and in English, so that they become specialists for modern industry, specialists in various sciences and arts, tourism and hospitality. This may be learning Russian for the African tourism sector, transport and communication, and many, many other fields of activity. So my two brief overviews have come to an end. Thank you very much for your attention and your time.
Спасибо большое, Олег Леонидович. Thank you very much, Oleg Leonidovich. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, and yes, you can ask Oleg Leonidovich. There is a question for you.
Let me just,
Yes, please, Professor, please.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Ms. Marina Bogdanova and you, Professor Oleg Mukovskiy, for this insightful lecture. Indeed, I felt like I'm traveling in time and I'm enjoying this information. Thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. First, I would like to highlight that the naming Mongols to Tatar has also influenced the Arab traditions and culture. We also call them that, and I could see that Tatar is also being referred to in old and ancient books. So that's a note I wanted to highlight. My question about Empress Elizabeth that managed to reduce the crime rate or managed to not implement any death sentence during her ruling. I would love to ask about the success formula for that. How did she manage to achieve that in ages where implementing death sentence could be seen as something necessity to reduce the crime? That was my first question. And the second question about Alaska. I could read resources about selling Alaska from Russia to the United States, but I couldn't spot the reason why. Some resources would say that Russia was in difficulty to manage that region, but I don't think so. So what was the core reason that would make Russia to sell that territory to Alaska? And one more question about this point: was that sale valid or legal? Okay. The third and final question.
Pardon me. What was your third question? Was that
I asked about Empress Elizabeth, and I asked about the reason.
Yes, about Alaska, and then after Alaska.
The third question is about Nicholas II.
Nicholas II.
Was he, yes, Nicholas II, was he a sort of, was he a distant relative to Windsor family in the United Kingdom?
Yes, yes, yes. So may I begin to answer?
Yes,
well, first
please.
of all,
And one more note about that, since I would like to wish you and the Alpha Dialogue team a prosperous and happy Easter. I also wanted to wish you a happy anniversary of the 80th anniversary of the Great Patriotic War that will come in 8th of May. And I was thinking about this memory as Stalin was the first and the only leader to fight Nazism in his own land and to win. I would imagine that there is no leader in the world has faced Nazism in his own land and defeat them but Stalin. Leaders in Canada, United States, and United Kingdom didn't face Nazism in their own land, but Stalin did that difficult formula. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Alpha Dialogue. Please, Professor.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed Hamid, for your very interesting remarks and your very practical questions. Very good for everyone, not only for you. So I agree that the Charter has influenced many civilizations, and we used to look at their time of their rule over Russia as something negative. But in recent decades, our historians tell us that they were the first who introduced speedy roads in Russia. And many modern Russian highways are actually built along the ways that Mongols were riding their horses, their hordes of horses. And they also established very up-to-date, well, there was no standard elsewhere, postal service in Russia as it had existed in their eastern part of Siberia and modern China, because they had to pass letters from Russia to China in a few days, and it worked. So as to the Empress Elizabeth, in Russia, when we had czars and emperors, all death sentences were to be authorized by the ruling monarch. She simply refused to sign them, and she would change all the death penalties into either pardoning the person or transforming the sentence into some long-term prison time. But then there was
Alaska.
Alaska, yes. That's, of course, I personally believe it was a tragic mistake by the Russian Emperor Alexander II. You know, Russia did explore and develop its colonies in America, its fortresses and its colonies in Alaska and down south to the area of modern San Francisco, the Northern California area. But then the United States were fighting Spain over the territory of Mexico and Southern California, because the southern part of the present-day state of California in the United States used to belong to Mexico and through it to Spain. Yet, although Russia did not want, Russia could understand very well that the United States would finally overcome Mexico, be it with Spain or separate from Spain, be it an independent country, and Russia would have to confront the rapidly growing United States. And then Russia would also have very bad relations with the Spanish monarchy in Europe, with Spain in Europe. So given these two factors, both of them were mistakenly evaluated, in my opinion, and not just in my opinion. Alexander II made a tragic decision to sell Alaska. And the Russian village was, I think, about 100 miles north of San Francisco. It's called Fort Ross. And there are still people living there who are descendants of the Russian merchants and military personnel who lived there. Nicholas II was related, not distantly. He was very well related to almost every monarchy in Europe. from Greece, Denmark, United Kingdom, and various German monarchies. Yes, well, his wife, Princess Alexander, was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria.
Interesting.
Queen Victoria.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thank you very much.
There was also a question that in questions written to us. In which year the diplomatic relations between Russia and Africa began? I cannot give you exact year, but I believe, well, there were Russian embassies sent to Africa since the beginning of the 18th century, but by Peter the Great, but they were not on a regular basis. So the contacts existed since the beginning of the first half of the 18th century, missions, and then many Russian emperors would send a mission on a particular case or for a particular issue to discuss something or to agree on something with different African powers. But of course, Russia began very active. Well, Russians like to travel to Africa since the end of the have expeditions since the end of the 19th century. That became very regular. But as to the Russian diplomats in a particular country, you have to check that up yourself for the relevant country.
Thank you, Oleg Leonidovich. Is
Yeah.
there other questions, please? Yes.
If not, then yes.
Hello.
Yes, Marina,
Hello.
there is a question.
Yes. Dr. Oleg, thank you very much for the very, very deep history that you have just summarized. 1,000 plus history
Thank
of the Russian Empire in just under 1 hour. That is a remarkable achievement.
Thank you.
Yeah. So now, one question I have for Dr.
Yes,
Oleg.
please.
Now, the Russian Empire was ruled by Nikolai I and his wife from a European country, which was from the Netherlands or something. And then the Tsar was
Alexander II.
Yeah. Russian Empire in 1918 when he was assassinated. Bolsheviki. And then afterward, do you think that the British have a grudge against the Russian people for this revolution because Tsar Nikolai, Tsar Nikolai was a cousin to King George V? That's the first question. And then the second question.
Yeah,
that's the first
let me repeat. Let me ask you.
Yeah.
So the question was whether the British helped the last royal family or not. Yeah.
Whether the British have a grudge against the Russian people for the revolution in 1918 that led to the death of the Tsar.
May I answer your question now? And I got it. May I answer it now, and then we'll proceed with the second question.
Yes.
Okay. So I don't think so, because the grudge, as you have said, between the British people, but in fact not the people, but the ruling class, the British elite, and Russia, began much earlier. In the 19th century, we had this very special expression in the Russian language since the beginning of the 19th century, Anglichanka gadit, which means the Brits are doing everything they can against us at every possible situation. This started way before that, the execution of the last royal family. And, well, the British actually did nothing to save their relatives. They could well have done something. But that's, I think, the British way of doing business overseas. And if you look at Prince Michael of Kent, when Nicholas the Second was killed when he was only 54. And Prince Michael of Kent, who is a senior member of the British royal family, when he was about his age in the 90s, some 25 years ago, he looked almost as a copy of Nicholas II. They are close relatives. Yes, and your second question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Oleg. That's a very impressive answer. And I understand why they behave the way they do, because the British are not very honest people. Because if they were honest people, they would have tried to maybe come and, because even they could have taken Nikolai to England, and then he lives there. And the King George.
I love Britain and the British people and their culture. And I used to live there for a long time and study. But I want to say that we have to have one thing in mind, very clear, that has never changed, and I doubt it will ever change. There are two moral standards, one for home and one for overseas, for everybody else. That's what you have to bear in mind, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And okay, the last question about the Alaska. Do you think, okay, number one, do you think that the Russian Empire, the monarchy should return to the Russian state, and then the Russian becomes an empire? And then Alaska, do you think Alaska should come back to the Russian Empire right now, because it was wrongly given to the United States by one of the Tsars?
Well, first of all, I'm not a monarchist in the modern world, so I really don't know. I don't think it's possible, because Russia is now so vast, so big. It has 89 subjects of the Russian Federation. It's a very, very big federation, the biggest country by land. It's the biggest country in the world, way bigger than any other country. And number two is Canada, of course, which is very scarcely populated. I don't think it's a way for Russia. But we'll see. Now in this world, in the 21st century, you can never say never. Yes, as to Alaska, I think it's, Russia. Well, establishing and having your presence in the Arctic region with global warming and other issues, military, trade, the Arctic Ocean, exploration of the North Pole. It's very important for a modern country, for an ambitious country, to have its presence in the Arctic area, in the Arctic region. Should Russia have thousands of square miles in the Arctic area, way more than Russia can handle well now, and most of them are uninhabited except for the polar bears and whales, Russia would have needed Alaska, but no. It's interesting to know that Alaska is across the Bering Strait from the Russian peninsula of Chukotka, and there are two smaller islands, the Big Diomede Island and Small Diomede Island. The big one belongs to the Russian Federation, the small one belongs to the United States, and the distance between them is 2.5 miles. And in winter, you can, when the ocean there is frozen, you can easily cross. America and Russia are much closer geographically to each other than people generally think.
But thank you very much. But I think that the Russian Federation must take back Alaska, because Alaska.
We had a myth in Russia and in the Soviet Union that Alaska was being yielded to the United States in 1867 for 100 years. When we studied the papers in the archives, the original treaty of 1867 didn't have this term of 100 years. And And Russia, present-day Russia, is trying to keep all the international agreements of the Russian Empire. So I doubt it. So legally, it's not very legal, unfortunately.
Yeah,
and taking it by force from the United States isn't a particularly good idea, especially given the present-day situation. I don't think Trump would agree.
But Trump wants to take Greenland. Trump wants to take Greenland from Denmark.
Exactly.
You should also take Alaska for the Russian Federation.
And we'll see whether he manages to take it or not. I'm extremely interested.
Oleg Leonidovich, thank you very much. Could I ask you to share your contacts? So if our dear participants have further questions, then they can address you directly through maybe
They can
email.
write to me, yes. Or you can send all your questions to Alpha Dialogue, and Alpha Dialogue will forward the questions to me.
Sorry, the sound broke.
All the participants can send their questions, their queries to you, to Alpha Dialogue, and you can forward them back and forth.
Yes,
and I want to greet everybody once again, say thank you for your attention, and for those who celebrate, Happy Easter. It is very rare when we Russian Orthodox people celebrate Easter on the same Sunday as do other Christian confessions like Lutherans, Catholics, and many, many others. Happy Easter.